First of all, it's a pleasure to be here this morning and to talk after hearing Paddy's wonderful presentation and after, over Christmas, having the pleasure of reading the book myself. And really all I want to do for a few minutes is just kind of to reflect on some of the things that he was saying to us. I'm a biologist, and I work, though, in a local authority where there are not too many other biologists. And I suppose in that kind of environment, I am very much aware of the need to bring the message of conservation and the importance of biodiversity to a wider audience, and to get people to engage with that in a real way that enables us to do something. And I suppose the first place I wanted to start off with, after reading the book and hearing what Paddy was saying, was the importance of this idea of engagement, I suppose, or just knowledge or awareness of biodiversity, of our dependence on it, the fact that we do live in a biosphere, we're part of it, we're not beyond it or beside it. In some ways, even the way we talk about the environment externalizes it, whereas in fact we are enmeshed in this biosphere, and sometimes, while I think all of us at some level are aware of that, certainly at a public policy level or even in the level of the media, this kind of understanding is very lacking. And I mean, even if you take the other great kind of environmental issue of our time, climate change, there is some traction in relation to that, but I would argue that there's almost no traction in relation to biodiversity. And I think scientists would argue that the loss of biodiversity is at least as big a problem for humanity as climate change is, at least, if not even a more troubling problem, because obviously once species go extinct, that's it. That is the end. There is no way back after that. So, I mean, so engaging with this material, knowing about it, having a debate about it in society, I think is really important. Some of the really important things I think that Paddy said during his presentation, I would just maybe mention three of them. First is, I think one of the insights in the book that I found really kind of resonated for me was by Dan Jansen, who kind of says that this narrative that we have, that we're destroyers of the environment or destroyers of the planet and we're destructive, isn't helpful. Whether it's right or it's wrong, it simply isn't at this point helpful. In some ways, all we're doing, I think he says it, he's quoted in the book as saying this, that we're only doing what successful species do, and we've done it very, very successfully. Now the point is, we're aware of that now and we need to do something about it. But beating ourselves up all the time is perhaps not productive in the end of the day. Allied to that then is this idea of talking to the people who don't think the way we do. That's absolutely vital. We cannot just sit in rooms talking to ourselves. We have to talk to people who don't normally engage with these kinds of issues, and we have to persuade them, and we have to understand why they can't engage with these issues in a way that we might feel they need to, and we need to create those kinds of channels for exchange of information. And lastly, in democratic societies, and this is a point Paddy made a few minutes ago, which I think is absolutely critical as well, there has to be the consent of the governed for things to work. It can't just be experts or scientists saying, here's the problem, here's the solution, now off you go and do it. That simply won't work. And scientists, I think, have to begin to ask themselves as well, why is it that there isn't greater awareness of these kinds of issues in society? And I think for academic scientists in particular, there is a greater role there, I think, for making themselves more available in the general public discourse around these kinds of issues. I mean, one of the great things about Paddy's book, I think, is that Paddy has taken the time to engage with the science, to get to grips with it. He has a very good understanding of it. If you read the book, the arguments, the ins and outs, the ups and downs, they're all very nuanced. But at the same time, he brings us the passion, the flair, of the individuals involved in doing this, be they scientists or activists or members of communities. That brings me on then to a second point, which is about responsibility. And I think it's about, we have to take responsibility for this stuff. We have to manage biodiversity or restore it, or we're in charge. We have to realize that. I think often this idea and our relationship with the word wilderness, we often think it's out there somewhere. David Attenborough is looking after it. Somebody else is looking after it. It's out there, and we don't really have to think about that. But the thing is, in my lifetime, a world population going from 3 billion, a little bit more than 3 billion, to at the moment 7 billion, to perhaps, if I live long enough, nearly 9 billion. That's an extraordinary change over one lifetime. And the world is not the same as it was when I was born in the 1960s. And it won't be the same in 30 years' time or 20 years' time as it is now, simply because there are more people. And we need to be really aware of that. And I think that's something that we're perhaps not aware enough of, is the rate of change, the pace of change. And another theme that comes through in Paddy's book from people who are interested in these novel ecosystem ideas is that the past isn't a good predictor of the future anymore. The future will be very different. And we have to, and there might be some sadness and letting go in all of that, because certainly we will lose biodiversity. But the point is, we have to make the best future we can at this point. And I think also the role here of the design kind of professions, as I would call them. Often I think ecologists perhaps come from a background of academic study, identifying a problem, but what restoration brings into it is this idea of doing something. We have to kind of mold the land, I think, if you like. As one landscape ecologist, a guy called Richard Foreman, said at a conference I attended a few years ago, his idea was we have to mold the land so people and nature thrive. That's the challenge. And it is that kind of challenge. And restoration brings that to us because restoration means doing things and failing and trying again and hopefully learning and getting a result at the end. Then also kind of underlying all of this, I think, is our relationship with nature. How do we relate, as I said earlier, just to the biosphere? And I suppose, the kinds of questions that Paddy was talking about there, what sort of world are we trying to, and restoration kind of captures some of these things about, well, what should we be restoring and what system do we pick? I mean, if we think about Ireland, we live in a landscape that has people in it for 11,000 years nearly. So nothing that you look at in Ireland in any sense is natural. It's all a cultural landscape. But that doesn't mean it's not full of biodiversity, and often the biodiversity has learned to be there in conjunction with the kinds of cultural landscapes that humans created. But how do we do that into the future? How do we sustain that? We can't perhaps go back to the kinds of farming systems that we did have, but what is that future? And I suppose we have to be able to, and I think E.O. Wilson is one of the people who perhaps over the years has looked at this idea. We have to develop a kind of a new relationship here with nature, with the natural world, with our place in it, with what with how we work, and that's challenging, but at the same time it's exciting, I think, as well. And I think we can also learn from the past. I think one of the things, as heritage officer with the council, obviously on the one hand sometimes I'm talking to people like archaeologists who say, oh, Ireland is a cultural landscape, and then sometimes I'm talking to ecologists who keep talking about nature as if people weren't there. And I think one of the sentences I know I underlined when I was reading Paddy's book is the idea that ecologists sometimes don't think enough about people and economists don't think enough about ecology. So, we need to understand that you know, that this relationship thing is really important, I think, as well as just the science and understanding what's going on. But that kind of fundamental relationship, I think is really important. And lastly, then, the last thing I wanted to talk about was just action, and the idea that in restoration, where we're actively doing things, that's not to say that in other forms of conservation we're not actively doing something. I think. But I think we may, or the general public may, think that the idea of a nature reserve is that you do kind of leave it alone and you don't do anything. But of course, by doing that, even that decision in itself is doing something. It's making that decision. So we are kind of doing something all the time. But I suppose one of the nice things and one of the nice focuses in the book is that it is about people doing things, local communities engaging with local issues in their patch of the earth, and it's kind of, you know, turning on its head maybe something that people who are not involved in conservation on a day-to-day basis might think is kind of a strange way or a different way to engage with the natural world. But as I said, in any event, even when we're doing so-called conservation in protected areas, you know, we quickly learn that often we need interventions in those areas, because often we're dealing in cultural landscapes where, of course, people have been implicated in these systems for a long period of time, and we can't just put a fence up around it and leave it. It can't work like that. So those are really just my own few reflections on the book. I mean, for those of you who've bought it, I think you know, again, one of the things I think I'd go back really to the very first point I made, which is about having a debate about this and opening up this world to a general debate in society. Because, as I said, I think the whole issue of biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity, how we manage to create a world which is good for biodiversity and also copes with perhaps 9 billion people or more, that's, together with climate change, is obviously one of the biggest challenges we face. But as I say, I think it's one that perhaps even has less visibility than perhaps that the climate change issue does. And I suppose even as we get to grips with climate change, we need to understand that there are other issues there as well that we can't not engage with, and this probably is the number one of those. So I'll leave it at that.